I had been on forward operating base Calder for 19 days when they searched the woman in the corner, and I want to say up front that I was one of the men who let it happen. I was a private first class then, which on Calder meant I belonged to the dining facility the way a wrench belongs to a toolbox. I cracked eggs by the case. I scrubbed the steam-lined trays until the steel gave my own face back to me. I hauled the trash to the burn point at the edge of the wire and stood there in the high desert wind while it caught, and I told myself that was a soldier's work too, even if it didn't feel like the war I'd pictured from the recruiting posters. The valley around us was the color of old bone. The mountains past the wire never seemed to get closer no matter how long you stared at them, and most days the only thing that moved out there was dust. Calder was a joint post, which meant we fed everyone. Army line companies came through, and engineers and the medevac crews, and now and then men who wore no patches at all and didn't talk and didn't sit long. The kind of men you learn not to look at directly, the way you don't look at the sun. The mess hall was the one place all of it crossed. 300 soldiers cycled through the DFAC at the noon meal, and for that hour the plywood building with its long folding tables and its humming reefer units was the center of the whole world. Men ate fast and talked loud and left, and we cleaned up after them, and the day rolled on. The trouble started 3 days before with the pallets. 2 pallets of bottled water and a Connex's worth of unit supply, batteries, cold weather gear, 2 cases of meal-ready rations stamped for a company that hadn't drawn them yet, came up missing from the supply yard between Tuesday's count and Wednesday's. On a base in the middle of nowhere, that is not nothing. Out there water and batteries and warm gear were the things that kept men alive, and a man who would steal them from his own was, in the unwritten arithmetic of the place, lower than the enemy. The first sergeants got loud, the provost got involved, and the provost on Calder mostly meant Staff Sergeant Tolliver. I have to be careful how I tell you about Tolliver, because it would be easy to make him a villain, and he wasn't one, not exactly. He was a big man gone slightly soft in the middle, with a square jaw and a voice built for a parade ground, and he loved the base the way some men love a thing they have decided is theirs to protect. He had been in 15 years. He had buried friends. He believed with everything in him that discipline was the only wall standing between order and the dark, and that the moment you let one thing slide, you had let the dark in. I think now that the theft frightened him more than he could say, because it was a crack in his wall, and he could not find the man who had made it. So he went looking. And a man who is frightened and cannot find the thing he is looking for will, often enough, settle for the nearest thing that looks wrong. She looked wrong to him. I understand now why. She had come in on the morning rotary with a kit bag and a rifle and orders nobody at the DFAC saw, and she had taken the worst table in the building, the one in the back corner by the reefer, where the cold air bled out and the light was bad, and she had stayed there through 2 meals like a stone in a stream that the whole base flowed around without touching. She wore a plain uniform, sun-faded, the patches stripped or never sewn. No unit. No name tape I could read from across the room. No rank that announced itself. She kept her sleeves down in the heat, which men noticed, because everybody else had theirs rolled. She ate slowly and watched the door, and the entrances, and the men, in a way I clocked even then without having the word for it. The way she seemed to be reading the room the whole time, cataloging it, the exits and the angles, like a person who had learned the hard way that a room was a thing that could turn on you. To me she was a mystery I didn't have time for. To Tolliver, by the 3rd day, she was a suspect. No unit, no patches, keeps to herself, came in right around when the supplies walked, won't roll her sleeves. I could almost hear the case building behind his eyes when he looked at her, and the worst part is I half built it with him. That is the thing I have had to live with. I was 19 and I wanted the staff sergeant to like me, and when he started watching her table, I started watching it too, and I let myself believe the quiet woman in the corner was probably the kind of person who would steal water from soldiers. It cost me nothing to believe it. That is how it always starts. On the 3rd day, he made his move at the noon meal, with the room full. I was on the line when it began, ladling beef and gravy onto trays, and I felt it before I understood it. The way the noise of the DFAC changed pitch. Tolliver came in with two of his security detail, a corporal named Briggs and a younger soldier whose name I never learned, and he didn't go to the line. He went down the center aisle between the tables with his thumbs hooked in his vest, and the talk dropped off table by table as he passed, the way wind lays down a field of grass. By the time he reached the back corner, the whole DFAC had gone quiet enough that I could hear the reefer humming. "Need to see your ID and your orders," he said to her, not unkind the first time, loud but procedural, "and I'm going to need to look in that bag." She looked up at him. I was close enough now I drifted down the line without deciding to, the way the whole room had leaned toward the corner to see her face for the first time clearly. She was older than I'd guessed, late 30s maybe, with a weathered, even-featured face and pale eyes that didn't widen and didn't narrow. She did not look frightened. She did not look angry. She looked at the staff sergeant the way you'd look at whether coming in over the mountains something to be assessed, not argued with. "My orders are with the S3, she said. Her voice was low and level. "You can call the Tactical Operations Center. They'll confirm me." "I'm sure they will," Tolliver said, "after I look in the bag." I want to be fair to him even here. He had a job. Things had been stolen. A stranger with no patches was, on paper, a person to clear. If he had made the call to the TOC first the way she asked, this would be a different story and probably no story at all. But he didn't make the call. He'd already decided, somewhere behind that square jaw, and he wanted the room to watch him be right. "On your feet," he said. "Hands where I can see them. Briggs, the bag." That was the moment the room understood what it was watching, and the moment, I think, that some of the men started to feel the first thin thread of wrongness, even the ones who'd been ready to believe it same as me. Because she stood, calm, unhurried, her hands coming up open and easy to shoulder height, no resistance in her at all, and the very smoothness of it, the trained economy of how she rose and turned and set her back to the reefer without being told, made a quiet that was different from the quiet before. The kind of quiet that comes into a room when something is about to be revealed and the room can feel it but can't yet name it. Briggs upended the kit bag on the table. It was almost nothing. A spare uniform rolled tight, a DOP kit, a worn paperback with the cover gone, a field notebook with a rubber band around it, 2 protein bars, a small hard case that Briggs popped open to find a cleaning kit, neat as a surgeon's tray, no water, no batteries, no stolen rations, nothing but the spare, hard-used belongings of someone who lived out of a bag and had learned to carry only what mattered. "Nothing, Staff Sergeant," Briggs said, and there was something almost apologetic in it. Tolliver didn't take the off-ramp. That is the part I've turned over the most in the years since, that the evidence was right there in front of him, the empty bag, the calm woman, the obvious wrongness of it, and he didn't take it. Because backing down in front of 300 men felt, to him, like the wall coming down. So he doubled. "Roll your sleeves," he said. She held his eyes for a second. Just one. And then she said the only thing she said in that whole exchange that wasn't pure compliance, and she said it very quietly, almost gently, the way you'd warn a man about a step he couldn't see. "You don't want to do this here, Staff Sergeant." It wasn't a threat. I have replayed it 100 times and there was no threat in it. It was a kindness, offered to a man too proud to take it. But to Tolliver, with the room watching, it landed like a challenge, and his face went a shade darker. "Roll your sleeves." She rolled her sleeves. I was maybe 8 feet away by then. And I saw it the same instant the men at the nearest tables saw it, and I felt the air go out of the room. On the inside of her right forearm, running from the wrist nearly to the crook of her elbow, was a tattoo, a dragon, coiled and rising, inked in black and a faded sea green, its body wrapped around a fouled anchor, and beneath it a line of small numbers and a word I couldn't read from where I stood. It was old ink, softened and spread the way ink goes after a decade under sun and salt. It wasn't a pretty tattoo. It wasn't a tough guy tattoo. It had the worn, sober look of a thing that meant something, the way a wedding ring means something. And even at 19, even ignorant as I was, I understood that I was looking at a mark that had been earned and not bought. Tolliver stared at it. For a second I think he didn't know what he was seeing either, and his mouth was already opening to push on, to say it doesn't matter, roll the other one, where's the water, when a voice came from the doorway behind him. Staff Sergeant, just the rank, but the way it was said stopped Tolliver cold. It was old Bowen. Master Chief Bowen, retired, 26 years Navy, now a graybeard contractor who ran the base's small craft and water supply liaison and ate his lunch at the DFAC every day at the same table by the door. He was a lean, white-haired man who never raised his voice and never needed to, and the cooks loved him because he always thanked us by name. He had been sitting with his tray the whole time, watching, the way the old hands watch everything. Now he was on his feet. And he was looking past Tolliver, past all of it, straight at the dragon on the woman's arm, and his weathered face had gone the color of ash. I had never seen an old man stand up that fast. I had never seen a man look at a tattoo the way Bowen looked at that one, like he'd seen a ghost, or the opposite of a ghost, like he'd seen proof that something he'd grieved was still alive in the world. His tray was still in his hands. He didn't seem to know it. He set it down on the nearest table without looking, very slowly, the way you set down something you're afraid to break. "Master Chief," Tolliver started, "this is a security matter I'd ask you to." "Do you know what that is?" Bowen said. It wasn't a question, his voice had gone rough. "On her arm, do you have any idea what that is?" Tolliver looked at the tattoo again, and then at the old man, and the first real uncertainty I'd seen all day crossed his face. "It's ink, Master Chief. Plenty of people have." "That's the St. Brendan," Bowen said. "The name meant nothing to me then. It means everything to me now." But I watched it land on the 2 or 3 other older men in that room, a first sergeant near the door, a graying medic, a contractor with a high-end tight gone silver, and I watched each of them go still in the exact way Bowen had gone still, a stillness that traveled person to person across the DFAC like a cold front, and I understood that whatever the St. Brendan was, it was the kind of thing that men who had been around long enough carried in a quiet, walled-off room inside themselves, and that the woman in front of us had the door to that room tattooed on her arm. The woman, she still hadn't moved from where she stood with her back to the reefer, sleeves rolled, hands easy at her sides, looked at Bowen for the first time. And something passed between the old Master Chief and the patchless stranger that the rest of us were not part of and could only witness. A recognition, not of each other, I don't think, of the same fire from different sides of it. "You were aboard," Bowen said. It came out of him almost as a whisper. "You were one of the ones who went back in." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was as level as it had been the whole time, but there was something underneath it now, something banked and old. "A lot of us went back in, Master Chief," she said. "Most of them didn't come out." Bowen opened his mouth to say more. He never got to. "The first rocket came in at 12:41, and I know the time exactly because the clock over the serving line stopped at 12:41 when the concussion knocked it off its nail, and I found it later in the rubble with its hands frozen there like it had decided to remember the moment for all of us. There was no warning. There is never the warning you imagine. There was a sound like the sky being torn down the middle, and then the fuel point at the north end of the base went up in a column of orange that I felt through the soles of my boots before I heard it, a thud that came up through the plywood floor and into my teeth, and then the building's east wall leaned inward and the windows blew their dust, and the lights died, and the whole DFAC was screaming. I want to be honest about what I did in those first seconds, because it matters for what came after. I did nothing. I stood at the serving line with a ladle in my hand and beef gravy down my front, and I did absolutely nothing, frozen the way a deer freezes, my whole body locked in a stupid animal certainty that if I didn't move the world would go back to the way it had been a moment before. Around me, 300 men were doing versions of the same thing, going down under the tables, shouting names, shoving for the doors that were suddenly choked with bodies. And the noise was a solid thing, and another rocket walked closer and the floor jumped again, and I would have stayed frozen there, I think, until something killed me. She was already moving. That is the thing I will carry to my own grave, that in the half-second the rest of us spent being afraid, she had crossed it and come out the other side. While Tolliver was still half-crouched with his hand on his sidearm, and his face slack with shock, while Bowen was bracing himself against a table, while I stood there useless with my ladle, the patchless woman in the corner had already gone from standing to a low, fast crouch and was reading the room. And I mean reading it, her head moving in short, sure arcs, taking in the leaning wall and the dead lights and the choke point at the doors and the orange light pouring through the blown windows. And then she did the thing that I have come to understand is the whole difference between people like her and people like me. She didn't run for the door with everyone else. She turned toward the trouble. Listen to me. Her voice cut through the screaming, and it cut not because it was loud, it wasn't, not really, but because it was level. It had no panic in it at all, and panic, I learned that day, is a thing a room can hear the absence of. Nobody stacks on that door, that wall's coming down. Move to the south side, low, away from the windows. Cooks, and her pale eyes found me specifically, the frozen boy with the ladle. You, with me, now. I have asked myself many times why I moved when she said it and not before. The honest answer is that her voice did for me what no amount of my own will could do. It reached into the animal part of me that had locked up, and it gave that animal an order it could follow, and following it was such a relief that I nearly wept. I dropped the ladle. I came around the end of the line. My legs worked. I went to her. "What's your name?" she said, already moving, already pulling a folded tourniquet from a pouch on her belt I hadn't noticed, already heading not away from the leaning wall but along it, toward the corner where the first concussion had folded a section of roof down onto the tables. "Brant," I said, "Eli PFC. Brant, you stay on my left side and you do exactly what I say when I say it and not a half-second after. There's men under that." She pointed her chin at the collapsed corner where I could now hear it under the roar, a thinner sound, the sound of men trapped and calling. "We're going to get them out. You're not going to think about anything but the next thing I tell you. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said, and I have never meant a word more. What I watched her do over the next 9 minutes I have spent years trying to describe, and the closest I have come is this. She worked the way water finds the low ground, without hurry, without waste, every motion connected to the one before it, no movement spent on fear or on anger or on anything but the problem in front of her. She got to the collapsed corner and she didn't heave at the rubble like a panicked man would. She stopped. She looked. She put her hand flat on a fallen beam and felt it, and she said, half to me and half to herself, "This one's holding the rest. We don't touch this one." And then she found the place where the load wasn't bearing, and she got her shoulder under a sheet of fallen roofing, and she said, "Brant, here, your back, not your arms." And the two of us lifted it clear, and underneath was a soldier I knew, a line company kid named Rays, pinned at the legs and gray with shock. And she was on him before I'd finished registering his face. She ran her hands down him fast and sure. Left femur, bleeder. A tourniquet came off her belt and went around his thigh, and she cranked the windlass, and Rays screamed, and she said to him, gently, without slowing, I know, you're going to keep that leg. Look at me. You're going to keep it." She wrote something on his forehead with a marker from her sleeve, a T and a time. And she said, "Brant, this man does not move until a litter comes, you understand. You hold his head still if the wall shakes." And she was already turning to the next call, already 3 feet away and reading the next problem. And I knelt there with Rays's gray face in my hands, and I understood that I was watching someone do, with total calm, the thing the entire United States military exists to be able to do, and that I had never once seen it done before. She pulled 4 men out of that corner in the time it would have taken me to lose my nerve. She never once raised her voice. She never once moved fast in the way that panic is fast, the jerky, wasteful, doubling back fast. She moved fast the way a thing moves when every motion is the right one and none of them have to be done twice. And the men she touched got quieter when she touched them. That was the strangest part. A wounded man would be thrashing and calling on God, and then her hands would be on him, and her level voice would be in his ear, and he would go still and do what she said, because some animal part of him recognized, the way my animal part had recognized, that the calmest person in a burning room is the one you follow. Then the small arms fire started, and I understood the rockets had only been the door knocking. This was the part nobody on Calder was ready for, and I include the seasoned men in that. We were a logistics-heavy fob. We fed people and fueled people and pushed supplies forward. We were not a fighting position, and the attack was built to exploit exactly that, soften us with indirect fire, blow the fuel point to make the smoke and the chaos, and then come through the wire on the north side while 300 support troops were screaming and stamping and leaderless. I learned all of that later. In the moment, all I knew was that a new sound had joined the others, the flat, hard snapping of rifle fire, close, and it was coming from inside the wire. Men were coming through the breach the fuel point blast had made. Calder was about to be overrun, and the only people between the breach and a mess hall full of unarmed cooks and clerks were a scatter of shocked logisticians, a frightened security detail, and one patchless woman with an old dragon on her arm. I saw Tolliver then. He had not run, I'll give him that for the rest of my life. He had gotten maybe a dozen men down behind the overturned serving line, and he had his sidearm out and he was trying. He was genuinely trying to do the thing he believed in, to hold a line. But his hands were shaking and his voice had gone high, and the men weren't moving the way he needed them to, because terror was eating his orders before they landed. He was a base cop in the worst firefight of his life, and he knew it, and the knowing was in his face. She crossed to him at that same low, controlled run, and she didn't take his weapon, and she didn't shove him aside, and I have thought a great deal about the fact that she didn't, because she'd have been within her rights and it would have been faster. Instead, she crouched at his shoulder close, so he could hear her under the noise, and she did something I would not have believed if I hadn't watched it. She gave Staff Sergeant Tolliver, the man who had searched her as a thief 20 minutes before, his job back. Staff Sergeant, level, steady, the same voice she'd used on Ray's. You've got good men here and they'll fight if you tell them how. I need you to hold this doorway, just this one. 3 men, good cover behind the line, short controlled pairs, nobody leans out past the frame. Can you hold this one doorway for me? And Tolliver, I watched it happen, Tolliver stopped shaking, because she had given him a problem the size of a thing he could actually do, not save the base, hold one doorway. His chin came up. I can hold the doorway, he said. I know you can. Hold it. I'm going to the breach. And she rose, and she picked up a rifle off a man who wasn't going to need it again, checked it in 2 motions, and she went toward the gunfire while every other living soul in that building was trying to get away from it. I lost sight of her for a stretch then, because I was doing what she'd told me, holding Ray's head, holding the next man's pressure dressing, moving the wounded back to the south wall the way she'd ordered. And I have to tell that part of it secondhand from Bowen, who had taken a rifle himself and gone partway after her, an old man of 60 moving toward the guns because a younger one had shown him it could be done. But the heart of what she did at the breach, the thing the whole base talked about after in voices gone low, I did see the end of, and the men who saw the rest told it the same way every time, which is how I know it's true. She did not charge the breach. Bowen was very clear on this and angry at anyone who told it as a charge, because a charge is a brave, stupid thing, and what she did was the opposite of stupid. She got to a fuel barrier of stacked concrete a short way back from the breach, and she put it between herself and the men coming through, and then she waited. She let them come. She let them commit to the gap and bunch up in it the way attackers bunch at a breach. And only when they were channeled and close and certain of themselves did she begin. And she began the way you'd close a door, methodically, near to far. And she did not miss. and she did not panic fire, and she did not stand up and scream. Short controlled pairs, Bowen said. The cadence of it so even you could have set a clock by it. And the breach that had been a flood became a trickle and then became nothing. Because the men trying to come through it had learned that the gap was covered by someone who did not waste rounds and did not get rattled and did not give them the one careless second they needed. She held the breach alone for the length of time it took the base's actual quick reaction force, a platoon of infantry from the far side of Calder, to wake up, kit up, and get across the fob to her. When they reached the breach, they found one woman behind a concrete barrier with a half-spent rifle and a calm that frightened them more than the firefight had, and they found the breach held, and they found, in the open ground in front of it, the cost of trying to come through a door she was covering. The QRF lieutenant, a man named Voss, told it later and always ended it the same way. I came up ready to retake that breach and there was nothing to retake. She'd already kept it, by herself. She just looked at me and said, "You're late, but you're welcome," and went back to work on the wounded. But she didn't go straight to the wounded. Bowen told me this part, and his voice broke on it the one time he told it. On her way back from the breach, with the QRF flowing past her to push the attackers off the wire, she stopped at the corner of the DFAC where the worst of the fire was, where the rockets had folded the roof, and the fuel from the ruptured line had run in under the rubble and caught, and the whole east wing of the mess hall was burning now, really burning, a sound like the inside of a furnace. There were still men under there. We'd gotten 4 out. There were 2 we hadn't reached, 2 whose voices had gone quiet under the rubble as the smoke thickened, and every man who'd looked at that fire had come to the same arithmetic I'd come to, the cruel necessary arithmetic of the survivor. That they were gone, that going in was dying, that the living had to be saved first. She looked at that fire, Bowen said, and she didn't do the arithmetic. Or she did, and it came out different because she'd done it before, in a place none of us had been, on the deck of a ship whose name the old men couldn't say without going gray. She handed Bowen her rifle. She stripped off her vest. She soaked a cook's apron, my apron, the one I'd dropped. Somebody handed it to her in a 5-gallon jug of drinking water and tied it over her face, and she went into the burning wing of that mess hall after 2 men the rest of us had already buried in our heads, 3:12 p.m. She was in there for 90 seconds. I counted them without deciding to, the way you count the gap between lightning and thunder. 90 seconds is nothing. 90 seconds is the length of a held breath, the time it takes to scrape 2 trays. Standing outside that burning wing with the heat pushing us all back a step at a time. 90 seconds was the longest stretch of my life, and I spent it certain that the patchless woman who had unfrozen me with 2 words was going to die in there for 2 men who were probably already dead, and that I was going to have to live the rest of my life having watched it. The first thing that came out of the smoke was a hand, then an arm, then the bowed shape of her dragging a man by the drag strap of his vest, backward, low, her soaked apron black now and her hair singed, and her sleeve burned through over the dragon so the old ink showed raw in the firelight, and she dragged him clear of the wing and into our hands, and she did not stop to breathe. She turned around and went back in. The second man took longer. We heard the wing come down further, a beam, a section of roof, a sound that made every one of us flinch and made Bowen take a step toward the fire with her rifle still in his hands and his old face working. And a private next to me started to say, "She's gone. She's not coming out of that." And I told him to shut up. The first order I ever gave anyone in my life. Told a stranger to shut up because I could not bear to hear the arithmetic said out loud. And then she came out of the smoke again with the second man over her shoulders in a carry that should not have been possible for a person her size. And she got 3 steps clear of the wing and went down to one knee and set him down with a care that broke something in my chest. And only then, with both men out, did she let herself fold forward and put her hands flat on the dirt and breathe. She didn't collapse. I want to be precise because the men who tell it as a collapse get her wrong, the way the men who told the breach as a charge got her wrong. She knelt and she breathed, 4 or 5 long, deliberate breaths with her head down and her burned arm trembling against the ground, and then she lifted her head and looked to see who needed her next. That was all the rest she took. The medics had the 2 she'd pulled. The QRF had the wire. For the first time since 1241 there was, for a few seconds, nothing for her to do, and you could see her body discover that it had been hurt, the burns coming up along her forearm, the smoke in her, the cost arriving all at once now that the work was done. That was the moment Bowen walked to her, and that was the moment the whole exhausted, ringing bass went still in a different way than fear had made it still. He walked through the smoke and the running men and the medics, and he stopped in front of her where she knelt, and the old Master Chief, 26 years, a man who had saluted admirals and buried more friends than I was years old, came to attention. His heels came together. His spine straightened the way a much younger man's would, and he brought his hand up in a salute so crisp and so deliberate that it was its own kind of language, and he held it, and his eyes were wet and unashamed. "Chief," he said, his voice would barely carry. "Chief Petty Officer, I should have known you the second you walked in. I'm sorry it took the fire." And she looked up at him from one knee, this woman they had searched as a thief 3 hours before, and she did the thing that I think about more than the breach or the fire or any of it. She got to her feet, slowly, the burn in her arm making her careful, and she came to attention herself, scorched and bleeding and swaying just slightly, and she returned the old man's salute. She returned it to him, as if the honor ran both ways. As if she were saying, with the gesture, that his 26 years and his held line and his old grief were owed the same respect he was paying her. "You held a doorway today, Master Chief," she said quietly. "Don't apologize to me about fire. I have to tell you about the St. Brendan now, because Bowen told me that night, sitting on a Connex outside the aid station while the medics worked on her arm inside, and I have never been able to separate the woman from the story since. The St. Brendan was a ship, not a warship, a converted support vessel, the kind of unglamorous workhorse that does the war's quiet labor and never makes the news. 11 years before Calder, in a straight Bowen wouldn't name, she'd been hit. Not in battle, quite, a fuel system fire that started small and turned in minutes into the thing that ends ships and the men inside them. The fire took the spaces below faster than anyone believed possible, and the order came, the way it has to come, to seal the affected compartments. You seal them to save the ship. You seal them, sometimes, with men still inside, because the alternative is losing the ship and everyone on her. It is the cruelest arithmetic the sea knows, and every sailor knows it and prays never to do it. There was an element aboard, a small joint detachment, special operators riding the St. Brendan as passengers to somewhere else, men and a woman who weren't even ship's company, who had no duty to her at all. And when the compartments below were ordered sealed with the damage control parties cut off on the wrong side of the bulkheads, that element went down into the fire against the order. They went into the sealed and burning spaces after the men who'd been written off to save the ship, and they passed them up through the smoke 1 and 2 at a time, and they did it in cycles, going back down each time the way you'd go back for one more, and one more, until the heat made even that impossible. They saved 19 men who were, by every rule and every reasonable arithmetic, already dead. 3 of the element didn't come back up. The ones who did were burned, most of them, on the arms and hands and faces, the way you burn when you reach into a furnace for another person. And afterward the survivors of that element had a thing inked on their forearms, not officially, nothing the Navy would put in a citation, just among themselves, a coiled dragon rising off a fouled anchor, for the fire they'd gone into and the men they'd carried out of it. The numbers under it were 19, the saved, and 3, the lost. The word, the one I couldn't read across the DFAC, was Pyre. It was her call sign. It was also, Bowen said, just the truth of what they'd walked into. "I had a friend on that ship," Bowen told me, looking at the dark mountains. "One of the 19. He'd have died in a sealed compartment in the dark if a handful of people who didn't owe him a thing hadn't come down through the fire. I never met them. I never knew their names. I just knew the mark. He was quiet a while. And then a base cop tells one of them to roll her sleeves because some water went missing. The water, by the way, turned out to have been a paperwork error and a contractor's mistake at the supply yard, miscounted on Tuesday, found mislabeled in the wrong connects 2 days after the attack. No one stole anything from anyone on Calder. There had never been a thief. There had only been a frightened man and a wall he thought was cracking, and a quiet woman in a corner who fit the shape of his fear. Tolliver came to her the next morning. I was there, refilling the water point near the aid station, and I stayed because I could not have made myself leave. He came alone in clean camis, holding his patrol cap in his 2 hands the way a much younger man holds his cap, and he stood in front of her cot. They'd kept her overnight for the burns and the smoke, and for a long moment he couldn't find the words. She watched him try. She didn't help him and she didn't make it harder. She just let him find it, the way she'd let the wounded find their courage. I searched you like a thief, he finally said, in front of the whole base. I had no cause but that you were quiet and I was scared and I needed somebody to be guilty so I could feel like I was holding the line. His voice was steady but his hands weren't. There's no apology that covers it. I'm not going to insult you by pretending there is. I just needed to stand here and say it to your face. Staff Sergeant Tolliver, I was wrong about you in every way a man can be wrong. She was quiet for a moment, and then she did the last thing I watched her do on Calder, and it was, in its way, the thing that taught me the most. She did not make him pay. She could have. He'd handed her the right to it in front of a witness and a smaller person, a person whose strength came from being respected instead of from being who she was, would have taken it, would have let him stand there in the cold of it, would have made the apology cost what it deserved to cost. She didn't. You held the doorway, she said. When it counted, with your hands shaking, you held it. I gave you one job in the worst hour of your life, and you did it. She looked at him steadily. A man who runs a bad search and then holds a doorway under fire is not a bad man, Staff Sergeant. He's a scared man who found out what he's made of. You found out, most people never do. She let that sit. We're square. Go be the kind of staff sergeant who calls the TOC first next time. Something went out of Tolliver's shoulders that I don't think had been out of them in 15 years. He put his cap back on. He came to attention, the second man in 2 days to come to attention in front of her without being ordered to, and he held his salute until she returned it, and then he turned and walked back toward his security shack to be, I have to believe, a better man than he'd been the day before. She left on the morning rotary, the way she'd come, with a kit bag and a rifle and orders nobody saw, her forearm wrapped in white gauze over the old Dragon. The whole DFAC found reasons to be near the flight line when she went. Nobody had ordered a formation. Nobody had to. The cooks were there, and the clerks, and the line companies, and Tolliver's whole security detail, and Bowen, and the QRF that had come up late to a breach already held. 300 people who'd had 1,000 other things to do and did none of them, standing along the edge of the LZ in the cold morning while a patchless woman walked to a helicopter. And when she reached the bird and turned to climb aboard, she stopped, and she looked back at all of us, the whole quiet crowd of people who had watched her searched as a thief and then watched her hold the wall between us and the dark. And she came to attention one last time, and she saluted the whole base at once, all of us together, the way you'd salute something you respected. And 300 people returned it as one, not on a command, not for a flag or a rank or a ceremony, for her. For what we'd seen. I have thought about that morning every day of the years since, and here is what it taught me. The thing I'd give a great deal to be able to put in the head of every 19-year-old who ever stood frozen with a ladle in his hand. The loudest man in the room is almost never the strongest one. The strongest one is usually quiet in the worst seat with her sleeves down, watching the exits, carrying the kind of thing that doesn't fit in a kit bag. And you will not know her by her patches, because she will not be wearing them, and you will not know her by her noise, because she will not make any. You will know her, if you are lucky, on the day the wall cracks for real, When the loud men freeze and the quiet one is already moving, already 3 steps into the fire you rode off, going back for the men the rest of us had the good sense to bury. I made staff sergeant myself, eventually. I have a base of my own to look after now, and young soldiers, and I tell them this story, all of it, the search and the shame in it too, because the shame is the point. And whenever someone walks into my mess hall quiet and patchless and takes the worst seat in the corner, I do not send a detail to roll their sleeves. I send the cooks to ask if they want the good coffee, and I call the TOC myself.